Good morning and welcome to the 5th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2020. Item 1 is a decision by the committee to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. And I should also mention that Jamie Halker-Johnson has given his apologies. Moving on to item 2 on the agenda, which is budget scrutiny for 2020 to 21. We have with us today the Minister for Business, Fair Work and Skills, Jamie Hepburn, and with him Kathleen Swift, who is Business Manager for Finance and Planning with the Scottish Government, Dominic Munro, who is Director for Fair Work, Employability and Skills, and Richard Rollison, Deputy Director for the Directorate for Economic Development for the Scottish Government. So welcome to all four of you this morning, and I understand, Minister, you have a brief opening statement to give to us.
I do indeed, Convener, and good morning to you and the rest of your colleagues on the committee. Convener, the Scottish budget has been set in extraordinary circumstances. The UK left the European Union on the 31st of January against the express wishes of the majority of the people of Scotland, and over the next year the UK Government will enter into trade negotiations with the EU, they have said, for agreement by the end of 2020. As such, the outlook for the economy continues to be dominated by Brexit and the significant uncertainty associated with whether a UK trade agreement with the EU will be reached and the potential terms of EU and non-EU trade agreements to take effect from that point. As a result, a no-deal Brexit remains a risk to the Scottish economy over the coming year, with the scale of uncertainty likely to continue impacting business and consumer sentiment. The other factor, of course, is the late UK budget, deferred from the 6th of November last year to the 11th of March, that has, as I think the committee knows, and indeed the Parliament knows, caused challenges in relation to uncertainty both in the funding available for public service in Scotland and in the implications of UK government tax policy for the country. Further delay to the budget would have only exacerbated uncertainty. So in that regard, the confirmation that the budget will proceed on the 11th of March is welcome. So it is against this background we set out our proposals for the finance, economy and fair work portfolio as was. Despite challenging headwinds, there are encouraging trends in the economy. The labour market continues to perform strongly compared to historic records, and Scotland's productivity continues to grow. In the year to quarter 13 of 2019, Scotland's productivity grew 0.8% compared to 0.1% for the UK. Independent growth forecasts for Scotland expect economic growth of around 1% this year and to strengthen gradually, although remaining below historic levels. So we need to do all we can to establish the right environment for business to grow, create jobs and invest. Our newly refreshed Economic Action Plan sets out a range of positive actions that the government is taking to deliver inclusive growth. It sets out how we will tackle the global climate emergency, grow an inclusive economy, and face up to the challenge of Brexit, changing demographics and shifting global circumstances. The Scottish Government is committed to delivering a successful economy that works for all of Scotland. Our approach to inclusive growth means that we are proactively investing to improve our prospects for longer-term transformational change, underpinned by a strong competitive economy alongside reduced levels of inequality and poverty. We're making a number of commitments in the budget to improve our competitiveness and boost investment across Scotland and support our commitment to fair work, enabling access to quality jobs and decent incomes. We are committing to providing £220 million for seed funding in 2021 to help support the establishment of the Scottish National Investment Bank. We are increasing the international trade and investment budget by more than a quarter as part of our ambitious plan to increase the value of exports from 20% to 25% of Scotland's GDP over the next years and to mitigate the impact of the UK's exit from the EU. We're investing in the new Manufacturing Institute for Scotland to bring together industry, research and the public sector to help companies across Scotland embrace new manufacturing techniques, support research and develop skills of our workforce. We'll maintain the UK's most competitive business rates regime with the lowest poundage and relief scheme, including the small business bonus and business growth accelerator, estimated by the Scottish Fiscal Commission to be worth £744 million, and will make at least £37 million available to support research and development projects to help meet our target of doubling business investment in R&D by 2025. We're investing around £2.3 billion in our colleges, universities and enterprise and skills bodies to provide the vital support required to realise Scotland's economic vision. And our Green Growth Accelerator model will extend the current Growth Accelerator model to unlock additional investment for infrastructure projects which support our transition to a net zero emissions economy. Convener, Scotland's employment rate remains high compared with historical records, and our unemployment rate remains low. This morning's labour market statistics exemplify that. There is a positive change on the last quarter. Employment is up now to 75%. Unemployment is down now to 3.5%, near the record low we saw last year. But I recognise there is more still to be done. We have to tackle barriers to work. We have to support training, and we have to promote fair work, all an essential element of improving Scotland's economy and improving opportunities for all. So we will continue to develop and deliver our Fair Start Scotland service, giving individualised support to 38,000 individuals who are facing the greatest barriers to employment. We'll double our investment from £10 million to £20 million in the Flex Workforce Development Fund, supporting the upskilling and retraining needs of Scotland's workforce. We aim to support around 2,000 women return to work following a career break. And as set out in our Fair Work Action Plan, we'll continue to work towards Scotland as a world-leading fair work nation. And as part of our new approach to funding employability services, we'll better align funding and deliver stronger outcomes for people seeking work, bringing together a number of existing funding areas, including the local employability model, employability fund and Community Jobs Scotland. This budget also supports discovering your potential, aimed at reducing inequality by targeting care experienced young people as one of the most disadvantaged groups within the labour market. We'll support parents to address barriers to work and provide on-work support to help low-income parents in work. And we will work to close the disability, employment and gender pay gaps. I hope that's helpful by way of opening remarks, but I'm of course happy, along with Kathleen, Dominic and Richard, to do my best, our collective best, to answer your questions.
Thank you, Minister, for that opening statement. You referred to challenges to the economy, and I'm just wondering, looking at the level 3 spend relevant to the economy and fair work remit of this committee, real term spend on enterprise, trade, investment, training, employability, amongst other things, is down. It's decreased. So I'm just wondering how decreasing spending in those areas is going to help meet the challenges to the economy that you've referred to in your opening remarks.
Well, I think it's important, Convener, to look at these things in the round. The first thing I would set out in relation to our enterprise agencies. Of course, we're moving into a new period where the Scottish National Investment Bank is being established to undertake its important work to support businesses to grow in Scotland. And when you factor that in, alongside the 3 enterprise agencies, we will now have, you actually see a 13.8% increase in available funding for those 4 entities. The other thing I would urge, and of course we operate importantly in a new phase of activity where we have the strategic board, which brings together not just the enterprise agencies but the skills agencies as well. Have to consider them in the round altogether, all pulling in the same direction. We see an increase in funding for universities, colleges, and also indeed our skills body, Skills Development Scotland. So that's supporting a range of other activities to support the economy through SDS, for example, apprenticeships. And the other thing that isn't included in this budget line is the important new area of funding through the communities budget in terms of the Parental Employment Support Fund. So when you start to factor these things in, actually, you start to see increased funding.
I'm just wondering about you comment on additional funding for universities, but in terms of training and the training budget, surely what we need is more funding to not academic forms of teaching or education, but more practical training in terms of the economy that we have.
Well, I suppose my first observation would be that plenty of academic training is practical training, Convener, but I understand the point you're making. That's why I also make the point that Skills Development Scotland's budget line increases this year as well. So that will allow us to continue to grow the number of apprenticeship opportunities that we have in the country. So we've committed to 30,000 such apprenticeship starts by the end of this parliamentary term. This year we've committed to delivering 29,000. I'm confident we'll meet that target. We continue to grow that area of activity through the other range of activity that we are laying out. We also see an uplift of the Flex Workforce Development Fund, which supports employers to identify their training needs. So that's doubling in value from £10 million to £20 million. We also, and I go back to the point I've made in terms of some vulnerable parents who might be disenfranchised from the labour market, struggling to progress in the labour market. We've created the Parental Employment Support Fund, which, yes, isn't in the finance, economy and fair work budget lines. It's in the community and local government budget lines, but it is directed towards that purpose. So the type of activity that you believe we should be undertaking is at the heart of what we're trying to deliver this coming year.
And I mean, the funding for the overall budget allocations for Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise are down. Are you thinking that the allocations to the SNIB will make up for that, or how is that
well, I think
envisaged to go forward?
In relation to Scottish Enterprise, we see some changes driven by the new reality we're in. So some of the areas of activity that were being delivered by Scottish Enterprise are now transferring to the responsibility of the Scottish National Investment Bank. And of course, the other important element that's going to be in our landscape, and I think there was widespread, well, I know there was widespread support because the Scottish Parliament passed the bill to establish the South of Scotland Enterprise Agency. So some, and presently that area is the responsibility of Scottish Enterprise, as the committee will know. So some funding is transferring to establishing the new South of Scotland Enterprise Agency. I go back to the point I made, though, convener, when you factor in the 3 enterprise agencies and the Scottish National Investment Bank, funding across the board increases by 13.8% this coming financial year.
We'll come on now to a question from Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you very much, convener. I just want to ask you a specific question, and it's about economic advice. If you look at the level 3 estimates, in 2012-13, the spend on economic advice was £1.7 million, and it's now forecast to be £12.5 million in 2020-21. The increase started shortly after the Scotland Act 2016 was passed. And with more volatility in the Scottish budget, can you give us an idea of what this extra spend and economic advice is getting used towards?
So there's 2 things that prevail upon that budget line, Mr MacDonald. One is a technicality, and I'll bring Kathleen in to explain more of that, but essentially it's now an accounting mechanism that total operating costs that weren't previously counted against some budget lines now are. That counts for the lion's share. And you as an accountant will understand these things probably better than I will, but I'll bring Kathleen in that in a moment. But the other area of activity, which I'm sure the committee will welcome, and I know next week we consider stage 2 of the Consumer Scotland Bill, and I'm very grateful for the activity and the engagement with the committee in relation to that piece of legislation. But some of the funding increase is related to us moving forward to establish Consumer Scotland. There is also, and we're moving from providing levy funding for Citizens Advice Scotland now to providing some grant funding, some £950,000 this coming year, which increases the amount of money that Citizens Advice Scotland has to spend in the area of consumer policy. So that's driving it. So part of it's a policy change to try and leverage more money into supporting consumers, which I believe is the right thing to do. And some of it's also about accounting. But I'll maybe ask Kathleen to speak a wee bit more about that, because it's probably not just across this budget line, it's across a number.
Yeah, so since 2019-20, the way we reflect our operating costs, we show them on the face of the individual portfolio budgets rather than within the administration budget. So for the economic advice, the majority of the increase, or the chunk of the increase, it relates to the operating costs now being reflected there. And the only other substantial increases are against the Consumer Scotland body. So we're increased by 1.75 million in 2021 to take account of the set-up of the Consumer Scotland. So those are the main increases in that budget line.
It's amalgamating costs that previously accrued across different headings previously.
Yes, yes. So effectively, we had an overall SG administration budget, and these are now being set across areas where they do the work. So the staff associated with those policies are paid from those lines.
One of our previous inquiries in this committee is about the lack of economic data. A lot of it is based on forecasts, quite small forecasts, etc. Is there any work being done in that area to improve the accuracy of some of the forecasting that we get? I don't mean budgeting, I mean economic forecasting.
In terms of any particular agency or just generally?
Just general.
Well, of course, and again, I might bring Dominic in to speak more about this because he's been quite involved in the work of the strategic board, but the analytical unit of the strategic board it has undertaken a range of work to try and improve data measurement. I mean, this is one of the eternal challenges for us to work out what's the appropriate thing to gather and analyse, and then work out how to do it. So there is some information available, but we're always looking to see how we can finesse it. But maybe ask Dominic to speak a little bit about the activity of the analytical unit in that regard.
Yeah, so thanks, Minister. I'd say three things. So firstly, the analytical unit spans across the enterprise agencies and has considerable new resource to devote into things like performance monitoring and assessment of the impact of activity. That is supplemented by the work happening in the enterprise and skills agencies themselves. So, for example, Scottish Enterprise, Skills Development Scotland will have this kind of forecasting capability. The third area is the continued investment that we're putting into the Office of the Chief Economic Advisor, which again is part of this line that you're referring to. So that is where the heart of the Scottish Government's economic forecasting capability resides.
We had a lot of difficulty with HMRC in terms of getting the forecast wrong when income tax first came out. Now that reconciliation is being resolved in the next year or so, do you see our forecast being more accurate in future for budgeting purposes now that we've spent more money in these areas?
So I think that question probably refers to the potential roles of either the Scottish Fiscal Commission or indeed, in a kind of Scottish context, or indeed to the work that our Exchequer colleagues do in terms of fiscal forecasting and Revenue Scotland. So each of these areas is covered within the budget, and indeed I know that we're expanding, we're investing to increase the capability of a number of those areas. So hopefully that would address the point going forward.
Thanks very much.
Right, Richard Lyle.
Yeah, on that question, Gordon MacDonald just asked you there, does that department track what our Scotland's imports and exports are? Do we have economic data on where we are, how well we're doing?
That would be the work that's undertaken by the Office of the Chief Economic Advisor.
Yeah. So we track that at the moment?
We do our best.
So there's an annual report on Scotland's export performance.
Yeah.
Imports is a bit trickier.
Yeah.
But each year that export performance report is published, which is based on a survey of Scottish companies.
So how well are we doing?
I think, I don't have the figures to hand, exports have gone up over the last year, and we've got our Trading Nation plan to, I think, increase exports to 25% of our GDP.
Bears with me, I think we have some information in relation to exports.
It's my understanding that exports have grown tremendously.
So, so some of this does come from the HMRC, which obviously we're not responsible for, but they do provide a breakdown of figures.
Figures is quite hard.
Well, it is when we don't have control over HMRC, I suppose, but they provide figures that show in the year ending September 2019, our goods exports increased by 11.3% in Scotland, which compares to the overall UK rate of 2.4%. So we've done quite well in the last year.
So a five-fold increase over what UK is doing.
I'm loath to commit to definitively working that out as the calculation
percentage-wise.
by taking one percentage
Anyway,
and the
that's-
other.
that's-
But we can certainly say we've done better.
Yes, that's interesting news. It's nice to know that Scotland's doing better than the UK. Basically, the Scottish Government plans to spend £30.3 million in 2021 on innovation and industries in the Level 4 budget. This is described as contributing towards the Scottish Government's growth ambitions for Scotland by cultivating a culture of innovation, entrepreneurship, global ambition among Scotland's innovators and early stage businesses. What does this spend actually buy us, or actually buy?
So around, in terms of the breakdown of those figures, there's £15 million of capital, £10 million of resource, and again, to go back to the discussion we've just had, the remainder is the total operating cost. Capital budget supports things such as research and development, our target that I've already referred to, of seeking to double business research, business enterprise research and development expenditure between 2017 and 2025. It supports our commitment to an additional £50 million a year on top of the £22 million already provided for research and development grants for each year from 2018-19. That type of activity will support a range of projects, creating new products, new processes, new services to try and improve a company's competitiveness, its productivity levels, to benefit the wider Scottish economy, sometimes to try and retain activity in certain areas. So one example of that was where we saw Texas Instruments seeking to leave Inverclyde, which is, I think we would all concur, not an area of Scotland we want to see significant economic activity leaving. So between Scottish Enterprise, Scottish Government and indeed Inverclyde Council, it was a real partnership approach through the Texas Instruments Task Force, which I latterly was part of. We worked hard to try and make sure that didn't happen. We supported Diode's purchase of the plant by helping them invest in the area of research and development, a grant over 5 years. Again, towards that end of supporting their processes, but that would, by my estimation, have made a significant contribution to ensuring that they came to Inverclyde. We also fund a variety of links between business and universities, the Industry Academic Links Fund, Knowledge Transfer grant, again making sure that Scotland's colleges and universities are better aligned and better supporting Scotland's businesses, and also other activity that we undertake in the entrepreneurial landscape. One of the areas of activity I'm involved in is the Women in Enterprise Action Group, which is, I know, an area of activity this committee has taken interest in. We're progressing our work, and I'll be happy to come back to and update the committee on that. But again, some of the investment will support that type of activity as well. So all, by my estimation, important activity designed to support Scotland's business and Scotland's economy.
Thank you.
Deputy Convener.
Thanks very much. Good morning, Minister. I wonder if I could just look at economic performance, economic outlook and productivity and issues relating to that. The papers we have as a committee in front of us tell us about the Fiscal Commission's growth forecasts and GDP growth forecasts, pretty much flatlining at a near zero growth. And they seem to be hovering around the heady 1% almost estimates for the coming year. If you look across the water to Ireland, they're predicting about 3.5% GDP growth forecast, and that's even down from previous years there of 5%. Now, the political debate in the Parliament, of course, is, are we using the levers at our disposal to best effect, and could we do more? Or are we short of economic levers that would allow Scotland to at least match and look forward to that kind of growth level that Ireland is currently enjoying? Could you give us a flavour of your take on this, and what levers are at your disposal that you're deploying, and what you consider we need to accelerate Scotland even further beyond where we are at the moment?
Well, it won't come as a surprise to Mr Coffey for me to agree with his perspective that I believe more levers could be in our hands here in the Scottish Parliament. But focusing on the budget before us, we've still seen economic growth here in Scotland. Is it as high as I think any of us would like to see? No, we'd certainly like to see a higher level of economic growth. We have, of course, faced challenges in terms of Brexit uncertainty. I encounter that when I, as you can imagine, as the Minister for Business, I'm regularly engaged with the wider business community through their representative organisations such as SCDI, Scottish Chambers of Commerce, CBI, and a range of other bodies. And they have all spoken of the challenges around that uncertainty, investment propositions perhaps being delayed through that uncertainty. I don't think we're through that period yet. That will continue to prevail upon the Scottish economy. So it behoves us to try and respond as best we can. And I think we're seeking to do that. I think if you look at the significant effort that's being undertaken to capitalise the Scottish National Investment Bank with £2 billion funding over a 10-year period, and I've already made the point that we're leveraging in £220 million this coming financial year. If you look at the significant resource that we are deploying in city and growth deals, some £200 million this coming year, again, that's designed to stimulate economic activity and, of course, the ongoing activity of our enterprise agencies working closer in hand with our skills agency and the Scottish Funding Council to make sure that the output of our skills and training system is better aligned to employer need to help them grow the economy. So we are trying to pull in that direction, but it is against the backdrop of challenging times.
When I served in the Finance Committee, it was kind of generally accepted that one of the biggest factors influencing productivity was workforce. Do you see that as a key factor in improving productivity in Scotland, to be able to grow and develop the workforce? Because it seemed to be generally agreed across that committee when I served on it that that was a key factor.
Yes, I think that is the key factor in a variety of ways. First of all, we need to make sure that people in Scotland have the requisite skill set to be deployed for the future. We know that we're living through a period of time, as I suppose we always are, where the economy changes. I would suggest the pace of change, largely through technological change, is accelerating that process. So we need to make sure that people have the requisite skill set to be able to cope with that reality, so that we have a productive workforce. In that regard, that's why we have the Future Skills Action Plan. That's why we have the Flexible Workforce Development Fund. That's why we continue to fund individual training accounts, and that's why we are working with the tertiary education sector to make sure that they are also ever more responsive to employer demand. Recently we saw a report that was commissioned by the Scottish Government on the economic impact of Scotland's colleges, which was taken forward by Audrey Cumberford, the Principal of Edinburgh College, and Paul Little, Principal of City of Glasgow College, which made a number of recommendations, again touching on this area, and we'll respond to them in due course. So yes, investment in people in terms of their skill set, making sure that they are responsive to the economic and indeed societal demands is critical. The other area that I think is absolutely crucial in relation to the workforce is our Fair Work agenda. Our Fair Work agenda, I think, is sometimes felt by some to be this woolly concept, this nice to do thing. It is an important social intervention because there is, I think, clearly self-evident benefits to embedding the Fair Work agenda for individual employees, to make sure that they're adequately remunerated, to make sure that their wider life circumstances are taken account of, to go back to the point I made about investment in them, to make sure that they are being invested in terms of their skills, their capabilities. But it's also of fundamental economic importance as well. If you actually look at those employers that are actively engaged in this area, particularly those who've maybe changed some of their work practices. We fund family-friendly working Scotland to promote the benefits of flexible working, for example. I've gone out to meet employers that have embraced and adopted that agenda, which is a crucial part of the Fair Work agenda, as is our promotion of the real living wage. When you meet those employers, they say not only do their employees benefit, but they benefit by employers, largely because they see reduced levels of absenteeism, they see greater levels of retention, but they also see a happier workforce, which becomes a more productive workforce as well. So in that sense, in terms of investing in the skills of our people, but also operating a fair work practice, I think how we focus on the workforce is of critical importance in terms of supporting our efforts to improve productivity. I should say, of course, though, Convener, productivity continues to improve here in Scotland and improve at a rate ahead of the UK as a whole, and we've virtually bridged the gap in terms of productivity at Scottish levels by comparison to UK levels. We've gone from a position where a number of years ago, I think, and I have the exact figures somewhere in my briefing here, of about 20% below UK levels. We're now at 99%. And if we continue to grow as we are, we're going to overtake the UK as a whole.
Lastly, for me, just last point in this, Minister, do you think your counterparts in the UK government are fully aware and realise the importance of Scotland being able to grow and develop and have access to a workforce to grow our economy? Do you think that's understood and accepted as how crucial it is for us to do that?
Well, in the sense of the fundamental challenge that employers are speaking to me of in terms of being able to source part of their labour supply from other parts of the European Union, no, is the answer. I don't think I've detected much sense that the UK government is sensitive to the requirements of the Scottish economy. Of course, we continue to engage with them on that basis. I seek to do that. Mike Russell, of course, seeks to do that with his overarching responsibilities for the Scottish government engaging with the UK government on Brexit. The other area, the proof is still in the pudding, in the sense of the UK government has taken forward an employment bill. I have some concerns around that, in that through the withdrawal agreement bill, they removed an element that was to do with retaining workers' protections that are set out by the European Union. That's been removed. That causes me concern. I would imagine that causes most members of this, hopefully all members of this committee, some concern too. They have said they're going to take forward an employment bill instead. We remain to see what might be in that bill. Of course, we're not sitting back in that regard. I have written to the UK government around some elements of that bill. I'll be very happy to share that with the committee if they would like. But again, that really relates to the Fair Work agenda. Of course, we saw the Taylor Review, which reported that the UK government is responding to ostensibly through this piece of legislation. We welcome some of the findings of the Taylor Review. Probably didn't go quite as far as we would like to see in terms of the Fair Work agenda, working to the elements of fair work as defined by the Independent Fair Work Convention, but we'll need to wait and see what's in that prospective legislation.
Thank you.
Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. You mentioned earlier the employment figures released earlier today. Those figures show that economic inactivity in Scotland is at 22.2%, which is well above the UK average of around 20%. The SFC have said that economic activity in Scotland, the higher levels, are part of the reason why there's a shortfall in income tax receipts in the Scottish budget, because if you have higher levels of economic inactivity, you don't have the same taxpayer base contributing to the budget. Can the Cabinet Secretary explain why long-term economic inactivity has been higher in Scotland, and what steps is he taking to address this chronic issue?
I suppose the first thing I should say is I'm not the Cabinet Secretary, Mr Lockhart,
Sorry,
but I'll do my best to answer your
I did.
questions.
You got an immediate promotion between the start of my question and the end of my question.
Well, I was just glad that before I came in we got confirmation the UK budget's going ahead on the 11th of March, so that's all the news I needed before I came in here. In terms of the points that Mr Lockhart makes about inactivity, I'm always very cautious about how we interpret that, because of course it covers a range of activity such as participation in higher education, tertiary education. You know, that is defined under the international precepts as inactivity for ill or good. It also includes the numbers of the disabled population, disabled people who may not be able to be employed, some of whom are interested in being employed. And of course, we seek to respond to that through Fair Start Scotland, which is reaching a higher proportion of the disabled population that we have here in Scotland, which is higher as a percentage of the population as across the UK as a whole. But in terms of our employment programme, we are reaching out to and engaging with a higher percentage of that cohort of the population than the UK government's health and work programme is. So, you know, we are seeking to, and again, I'm not looking to use the term tackle, because I go back to the point that so-called economic inactivity covers a range of activity, but we are looking to interact with some of the challenges that Mr Lockhart has set out. But again, I wouldn't like anyone to think that any of these figures that are out this morning are anything other than good news for the Scottish labour market, something I'm sure Mr Lockhart would agree with.
Thank you for that answer. I'd like to now move on to the Economic Action Plan, because in the budget, the Economic Action Plan takes centre stage, and the budget document states that it's showing progress in delivering existing actions. But according to the Fraser of Allender, there is no analysis in the action plan of any impact of policy in response to new priorities or failures or targets. In other words, the action plan doesn't have any explicit targets, resource allocation or time horizons as you would expect in an action plan. Is it fair to call the Economic Action Plan an action plan?
Well, I think so, but I'm always open to suggestions, Mr Lockhart, although I'd need to hear yours first before I consider whether that was a fair reflection of what it might be. Yes, I think it is an action plan. If you look at what is laid out within the action plan, such as the taking forward the Scottish National Investment Bank, making that operational this year, that's something that will happen. If you look at the commitment to leverage in an additional £10 million for workforce development through the Flex Workforce Development Fund, that is happening this year. We continue to invest in the creation of the National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland. We're increasing infrastructure investment through delivery of the National Infrastructure Mission. We are creating the dedicated website for business support. These are all laid out within the Economic Action Plan, so I would define those as actions and action we're taking.
I appreciate this long list of initiatives, but it seems to me that the Scottish...
It's a long list, Mr Lockhart.
But there's another point to my question, Minister. It seems to me the Scottish Government has moved away from an evidence-based economic policy. In the National Performance Framework, there are no longer any specific economic targets that the Scottish Government is working towards. Previously, there were 7 economic targets set up when the Scottish Government came to power, and evidence to this committee and in the committee report highlighted that all 7 of those economic targets had not been met. The Scottish Government had failed to meet all 7 of those targets. I guess my question is, how can you measure the impact of policy and the success of policy or failure of policy if you can't run it against specific targets that those policies are meant to reach? Can the Minister explain why the Scottish Government has moved away from an evidence-based approach to economic policy and the failure to set targets for the impact of economic policy?
Well, I don't accept the premise of the question, frankly. Not every target that we set will be in the National Performance Framework, and there are targets in the National Performance Framework that relate to economic outcomes. So fundamentally, I disagree with the premise that we aren't working to an evidence base. I think everything that we seek to do is on the basis of a recognition that we need to continue to try and grow our economy, to try and create a fair work culture in our economy. That's taken forward in a range of evidence that we have gathered. And to go further still, we know that, and again I'll maybe ask Dominic to say a bit more about this, but the analytical unit of the Enterprise and Skills Review has been undertaking some work to try and embed an evidence-based approach to the strategic board's work, and again that's utterly linked to the National Performance Framework. So the idea that we and those agencies and bodies that we task with supporting the Scottish economy doesn't work to any form of evidence base, I don't think stands up to scrutiny. But Dominic, can you maybe say a little bit more about the work I've referred to in terms of the work that's happening at the strategic board?
Yeah, so I'll mention 2 things, Minister. So firstly, just to follow up on your earlier point about the premise of the question. So I think it's important to distinguish between whether we have targets and whether we have an evidence-based approach or not, because I don't think that targets are a prerequisite for an evidence-based approach. Nevertheless, I think it's worth noting that we do still have a number of targets, even those headline targets that you referred to have now passed. So, for example, we've got targets around doubling R&D by 2025, and also increasing our exports to 25% of GDP in the near future. So I think it's fair to say that we still do retain some targets, but as I say, these aren't the basis for an evidence-based approach. On that second point, as the Minister has mentioned, the analytical unit on behalf of the enterprise agencies is assembling a range of more evaluative evidence to look at the impact of the work that the agencies are doing on different outcomes. So, for example, the work of the education agencies, Skills Development Scotland and the Scottish Funding Council, and their roles in relation to higher education and further education on improving the educational outcomes of people using the different forms of education in the system. So that's the kind of evidence base that we're continuing to use to drive our broader economic policy.
Thank you.
Just to revert back to the point I made about the National Performance Framework, there are what we would define as 9 business and fair work indicators. The number of businesses being one, high growth businesses being another, innovative businesses being another, economic participation, employees on the living wage, the gender pay gap, contractually secure work, employee voice, gender balance in organisations. I think these are all could be fairly assessed as economic measurements, and they're at the heart of the National Performance Framework.
Let me ask one final brief question. The First Minister a couple of weeks ago said that well-being would be at the centre of the government's policy in terms of tracking performance. About a couple of weeks ago, the index of well-being showed that Scotland has slipped down the charts from 16th place to 22nd. First of all, Minister, do you think that's unacceptable for performance? And secondly, what is the Scottish Government's target for Scotland to move back up the well-being international table?
Well, beg your pardon, Convener. I'm aware of Professor McLaren's work in this area. Any work that's undertaken of that nature is a welcome contribution. I'm not sure it could be defined as an official publication per se, as a comprehensive, internationally recognised index of well-being. But yes, of course, we want to perform better in that regard, and that's why a considerable amount of effort we're undertaking relates to, I'll go back to the point that Fair Work agenda is an economic imperative, but it's also an imperative in the sense of embedding well-being as well. So yes, we want to do better, and yes, we're committed to achieving that. In terms of any target having been set against that particular measurement, I'm not aware of one having been set.
Thank you.
Andy Whiteman.
Thanks, Convener. Thank you, Minister. I want to ask a few questions about the Scottish National Investment Bank. First of all, just for clarification, in the level 4 figures for the SNIB budget, there's figures given for 2019-20. For example, Scottish National Investment Bank financial transactions expenditure of 120 million. I mean, I presume that's just being labelled as SNIB, but isn't really SNIB because SNIB didn't exist.
Can you direct me to the part of the budget, Mr. Whiteman?
I don't have the budget document, but it's the level 4 SNIB budget figures.
Okay.
They're not in the budget, they're in...
Bear with me, and I'll try and ascertain. Right. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So the level 4 SNIB budget allocation for 2020-2021, we've got a 2019-20 Scottish budget.
Yes.
Figures for them. SNIB didn't exist, so I'm just...
Sorry,
this
yes.
This is just for clarification.
That's right, yes. So a lot of this relates to the activity that is now being undertaken by SNIB that was undertaken previously.
Yep.
Yes.
And so is that a fairly... I mean, how useful is the comparison of the two figures when the SNIB, once it becomes operational, will be doing more, presumably?
Well, it's useful insofar as we need to try and demonstrate the type of activity that's been undertaken before to give an indication of the type of activity that might be undertaken going forward.
Okay,
I think it's useful.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, that's fine. Right, on the timeline, we've got a budget of 281 million for 2020-2021, and SNIB is going to be operational in 2020. Do you have a date?
In terms of when it'll be operational?
Yes.
It'll be operational later this year. I don't have a specific date for you, but it
So
will be operational later
1st
this
of
year.
September, sort of.
That sounds to me like a specific date, and I think
Okay, sorry, okay, later.
Sorry, yes, my official reminded me, if this is helpful, the second half of 2020. But
Second half
again,
of-
that's still not a specific date.
No, that's fine. Okay, no, that's no problem. So some of the expenditure that's down for 2020, for 2020-21 is money that is being actually spent now on activities that are being undertaken by Scottish Growth Fund, Scottish Enterprise, that will, after the bank is formally established, be the Scottish National Investment Bank as well.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think we were told by the Scottish Government previously in relationship to the initial stages of the SNIB's operation that Scottish Enterprise would continue to provide some early stage capital, but by the end of the transition period, all relevant businesses will transition over. What does that transition period look like? Is it a year, 2 years? Or is that...
I would be loath to put an exact timescale. It has to be at a pace that's appropriate and can continue to support businesses in the manner that you would expect it to. There will, of course, still be an ongoing role for Scottish Enterprise in terms of supporting business through account management, in terms of some of the products it will continue to retain. So there will be that ongoing process of interaction between Scottish Enterprise and the business community, as you would expect. But in terms of a specific timescale in relation to the points you made, I would be cautious about giving a precise one because it's going to be an ongoing and iterative process.
Okay, in terms of the longer term nature of the SNIB, you're in negotiations with HM Treasury about derogations. Can you tell us a little bit more about how those discussions are going and what are the implications for the Scotland Reserve if the derogation is not agreed?
Well, I know that the previous Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Economy and Fair Work has been in correspondence with both the then Chancellor Philip Hammond and the then Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Liz Truss, on a number of occasions about the bank being provided with the required derogation. So this is something that we've been engaged in for a while. Dialogue about this matter continues to be undertaken at the official level. If more detail on that is required and we can supply elements of that, I'll be happy to follow up or ask officials to follow up
So
writing
my
in
understanding
terms of that. I think you're about to ask in terms of the reserve, which I'm just about to come on to, unless it's a different issue.
No, I mean, my understanding is that derogation is a straightforward decision of Treasury.
That's right.
To grant the derogation, and that would be notified to Scottish Government. It's a straightforward decision.
Yes.
So you've been in discussion with 3 ministers at the UK Government over the past, 2-3 years. It sounds like you're getting nowhere. Or are you getting anywhere? Or what are the stumbling blocks? Or what are the issues to be resolved? Or what are the undertakings that are being asked of you?
We'll need to. I've not been leading on the Scottish National Investment Bank, Mr. Whiteman. So in terms of some of that detail, I'll commit to following up and providing what we can. You are correct that it should be a fairly simple matter for the UK Government. I hope they're listening to the point you're making in that regard. But the dialogue continues, and we hope to have that finalised. But in terms of the bank being able to operate, you are correct to say that the Scottish Reserve can kick in. That does mean it has to operate in a slightly different way than we would hope it could, in terms of expenditure has to be out the door in any given financial year. But the work continues in terms of trying to seek that derogation, and I can commit to following up in more detail. I don't know if, Richard, you can say any more about it at this stage.
I think Mr Whiteman's right in that, so if the derogation isn't granted, then it will be a call on the Scottish Reserve, and the bank will be operating in the same way as other public bodies. So as Mr Hepburn said, it would need to deploy its capital in year, which I guess would make the need for really rigorous monitoring of that finance much more stringent, and it would probably take longer for the bank to kind of ramp up to its full financial strength. I think, as Mr Hepburn said, there's still dialogue at official level, and I think that leads into the review of the fiscal framework, which is happening at a UK and Scottish Government level. So if it could be part of that fiscal framework review, that would help.
Well, Convener, I'm happy for us to commit to looking at providing more by way of an update in writing to the committee, if that is helpful.
That'd be helpful, just to get some sense of, obviously there'll be confidential matters between officials being discussed, but some sense of where, I'm a little bit troubled at the suggestion that it's part of the fiscal framework discussions, because really, I'm not sure that it should be, but...
Well, the scope for it to be in there, I'm sure we would rather that it was agreed now. So.
Okay, thanks. Moving on to regional selective assistance, which this committee's been taking a look at. We were concerned at regional imbalances in regional selective assistance spend, and got figures from Scottish Enterprise to that effect, which illustrated, for example, that there were no RSA funding at all between 2016-19 in Orkney, Western Isles, Argyll, Bute, Clackmannanshire, Eastern Bartonshire, Highland, Inverclyde, Murray, or Orkney. We invited the government to consider setting regional targets. The government didn't commit to this, but said that the enterprise agencies will work with and through regional economic partnerships to meet the distinct needs and opportunities of each region. Can the Minister provide any clarity on how these partnerships are working?
Yeah, well, they're at different stages, but just to respond to the overarching point, and I'll return to the specifics about regional economic partnerships. I understand the desire, the request for setting regional targets, but in my experience, and I think I know Ivan McKee responded to the pre-budget scrutiny report that the committee helpfully pulled it together. I think he made the point, and it's one I would fundamentally agree with, and it comes from my own experience of interacting with businesses in terms of my business responsibilities for the government, that I don't think we could operate regional selective assistance on the basis of setting regional targets. Ultimately, it's a demand-led product. It relies on businesses coming forward with a valid proposition for full consideration. That said, I would, of course, be delighted to see those parts of the country that haven't benefited by regional selective assistance being able to do so. And I think that's where there is scope for us to consider, through the ongoing development of regional economic partnerships, which are designed to be, by their very nature, grassroots, in the sense of it's a series of bodies that look different in different regional economies, invariably involving local government as part of the process, but also the local business community, perhaps the tertiary education institutions in that area, and of course the Scottish Government enterprise agencies being involved as well. I think there is scope for our enterprise agencies to engage with them, to see what opportunities might exist to try and see a wider range of parts of the country benefiting by regional selective assistance. So I just think it would be very difficult for us to set the regional targets, although I can understand why that might have been suggested. That said, we have committed to ensuring that Scottish Enterprise can provide as much information as possible about where the investment is being made.
Okay. The new chief executive of Scottish Enterprise has talked about a place-based approach, etc., and I'm aware that there is criticism that the South East is overheating the Edinburgh Lothians economy, and we should be trying to direct investment to those parts of the country where we face more economic challenges. Now, obviously, RSA is a very small part of that, but do you generally agree with the principle that we should be directing what resource and support we have to areas of the country that need that help and support?
Well, I think if you look at RSA investment, a lot of that has happened in terms of the wider Glasgow City region. I should declare an interest as a representative of a constituency in that area, but it also includes Inverclyde, as I've referred to earlier. It includes Ms Bailey's constituency as well. These are parts of the country that we know there are particular challenges, and it behoves us to respond to that. We're seeking to do that in a number of ways. There is, of course, the city region deal that's been put in place, but also there have been a number of successful approaches for RSA funding, and I think you reasonably make the point, Mr Wakeman, that is only one portion of the offering that exists through Scottish Enterprise funding. A lot of that has been directed at the parts of the country that you are rightly concerned about.
Okay. In the government's response to...
It's very generous of you, incidentally, as a representative of the Lothians to take this
I'm aware I'm here as a committee member rather than as a... and this is the Economy Committee looking at the economy of Scotland. Scottish Government's response to the committee's budget scrutiny work stated that Scottish Enterprise has established a business response unit to engage with companies that are facing financial difficulties. How is that going, and how early stage will that engagement be?
Well, a lot of that ultimately depends to how quickly the information is provided to Scottish Enterprise, and that can be different from situation to situation. And it sometimes can be a real source of frustration to Scottish Enterprise, and then to me when I find out that there's a business that Scottish Enterprise has hitherto had a very positive relationship with, who will only come forward very late in the day to say they have difficulties. There are others who will identify it quite early on, and that is much more helpful because invariably it gives you a longer lead-in time to try and assist them. So essentially, this response unit is designed to intervene as soon as possible, as soon as it becomes clear that some form of intervention is required. I find it enormously beneficial because it works very closely, hand in hand with the Scottish Government's business briefing unit, where we find certain circumstances arising that require a fairly concerted approach, so that Scottish Enterprise and Scottish Government are working very closely with the individual business, or in certain circumstances with the administrator that's administering a business that's in a difficult set of circumstances. And you know, sometimes that leads to more positive outcomes than others. The great
Minister, I'm wondering if we could move on perhaps to other committee members' questions and other topics perhaps. And
the positive example of
I
Archer
think
Wiggins,
you've
where we
already
saved that company in Aberdeen through
I think
the
you've already
efforts
mentioned
of that
numerous examples you think are positive, so we'll move
I
on
think
to
the workforce
Jackie
there,
Bailey now.
450 employees thought it was a very positive outcome too.
Thank you, Minister. I've got a very couple of quick questions before I move on. Can I take you back to the Scottish National Investment Bank? And can I ask you how much of the £2 billion is financial transaction money? And have you had confirmation that financial transaction money will continue beyond 2021?
I can tell you, I can't say for the full £2 billion, Ms Bailey, but I can tell you for this year there's £260 million for financial transactions helping establish the launch of the bank.
And how much is capital that the Scottish Government have put in?
There's £21 million in resource. In terms of capital, I might ask Richard to respond to that.
So the bank's investing either loans or equity in companies or mission-based projects. So it's principally FTs.
It's true to say that going forward, you're heavily reliant on financial transaction money, and we have no confirmation yet, unless you're about to tell me good news, that this will continue beyond 2021.
Well, what I can tell you is we're committed to taking the bank forward, and we've said we'll capitalise it by £2 billion. We will need to respond to the circumstances as we find it.
Okay. Do you have a plan B? Do you know where that money's coming from if financial transaction money isn't forthcoming? I mean, I hope it is, but if it doesn't, how are you going to meet that commitment, given that you have an upper borrowing limit of 400 million each year and lots of other commitments for infrastructure?
Well, we're engaged clearly in the process we're engaged in right now, and like you, I hope that we can continue to utilise that as an effective and well-established part of the budgeting landscape that's been in place for some time, and I hope we can continue to use it. We respond to the circumstances we find ourselves in, Ms Bailey. That's what we're doing right now with Brexit, for example, on a wider basis. So that's what we will do as it arises.
I suppose my concern is the lack of a contingency, should that arise, because it will blow an absolutely huge hole through your plans, which this committee has supported, for a Scottish National Investment Bank. So if people wanted to write to me later about a plan B, I would certainly appreciate that. Can I move on to the Scottish Growth Scheme, if that's okay? There was a big announcement made, I think, in the programme for government about the Scottish Growth Scheme being in the order of £500 million to be spent by 2020. Up to December, you'd spent 35% of that. Can you give me an idea of when you'll reach the 500 million and what demand stimulation activities are ongoing?
Well, I think the first point I would make is that the last figures that we've released show that there's been £196 million of investment realised through the Scottish Growth Fund. I think we would all agree that that's a fairly positive figure in terms of investment into the Scottish economy, into Scottish businesses. There have been challenges in terms of realising some of our ambitions around the Growth Fund. I refer back to the comments I made earlier, speaking to the business community about a series of investment assumptions that may have been taken forward. maybe being held off on because of the wider circumstances around Brexit. So that has caused some challenges around traction. But of course we continue to promote it, and we rely on our enterprise agencies to actively promote the Scottish Growth Scheme, the benefits of the Scottish Growth Scheme, and indeed individual Scottish ministers as well when we're engaged with the business community. I think I've got, in terms of visits organised by the Business Briefing Unit between the various ministers and the Finance, Economy and Fair Work portfolio, and this financial year we're up to over 400 such visits, and we're actively promoting the Scottish Growth Scheme all the time.
I entirely accept that, but the growth scheme was for Brexit. You know, that was the reason behind developing it, and we welcomed it at the time. Brexit is upon us. Do you have a target to get the money out the door, say by the end of the year? You know, what is the revised profile for spend?
Well, the mechanism remains in place. We said it would be in place for 3 years, and we're doing everything we can to try and get as much of that spent as possible.
So it'll
through the mechanisms that we have laid out. Okay,
so it runs from 2017 to 2020.
Yep.
You're saying it finishes this year and is not rolled over, there's nothing else?
No definitive decision's been made in that regard. There is, of course, a new Cabinet Secretary for Finance in place, and that may be something that she wants to consider in conjunction with the new Cabinet Secretary for the Economy.
Oh, so it might end, we don't know yet.
As I say, there are new Cabinet Secretaries in place. They will want to consider these matters in conjunction with one another. Well, of course, I do make the point, we are moving into the new landscape where the Scottish National Investment Bank's in place as well to try and stimulate this type of activity.
My next question then maybe helps as a follow-up, because the Scottish Government's response to the committee's budget scrutiny stated that it has no plans to undertake a review of all financial products. But the former Cabinet Secretary suggested a review was forthcoming. Who's got it right, Minister?
I think this, I had a look at this, and I think this comes down to a difference of interpretation as to what the Cabinet Secretary said. So I think the point he was making when he was in post, when he was before this committee, is that it's incumbent on us, and I would accept this, to constantly review and assess the efficacy of the approach that we take. I think that was the point that was being made in response to the committee. I think the exact quote is, I think it is right to look at the range of financial products that we have to decide what the appropriate balance might be for the future. And there was a follow-up question that was in response to Mr. Lyle. First point, I'm not sure who asked the follow-up question, and I think the point he was making is we need to review all our financial products anyway in that context. He wasn't suggesting that there was going to be this one specific overarching review.
Well, will you review then, let's be very specific, the Scottish Growth Scheme?
Well, I've made the point already, there are new Cabinet Secretaries in post, so that may be something they want to consider.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, I'd like to look at the landscape around business support, and initially specifically about Business Gateway. The committee report on business support highlighted two things about Business Gateway. One was overall funding hadn't increased in 10 years, and secondly, that the landscape was pretty varied in terms of how the different councils approached it, what they spent on it, and how effective the outcomes were across the country. Now, at the time, I think you previously, or the Scottish Government previously informed the committee that it was discussing the committee's recommendations in relation to Business Gateway with COSLA. Can you give any further details as to how the Scottish Government plans to address the role of Business Gateway as part of the sort of wider economic development system?
Well, I think it is important to remind the committee, and if I said anything else, I think COSLA would quickly follow up and remind the committee that Business Gateway is the responsibility of local government. Nonetheless, recognising the points that were made out of the review that this committee helpfully undertook in relation to the landscape of business support, that there has been some work between the enterprise and skills agencies, through the strategic board with Business Gateway to consider how the products and services that are in place can be better aligned with one another, looking at some form of shared capacity, shared platforms, shared operational and governance processes to try and make the landscape easier to traverse for businesses. But it's not something that's achieved readily because there are obviously complexities involved, and because it's the responsibility of local government, that of course has to involve local government. It's entirely appropriate and correct that that is the case. So those discussions continue between the Scottish Government, COSLA, and critically between the enterprise skills agencies and Business Gateway. Dominic, maybe invite you again though, because clearly this has been an area of activity for the strategic board. Maybe you can add a bit more.
So I think possibly two things to mention. So I think, as you've already referenced, Minister, the representatives of Business Gateway have come along to strategic board meetings to consider how they can best engage with the agencies. I think the other point that is worth mentioning is that in thinking about the new single economic portal, findbusinesssupport.gov.scot, we are actively thinking about how Business Gateway can dovetail with that interface, so that businesses get that joined up service no matter where they're looking for support. So it's all about respecting the kind of different governance of Business Gateway in relation to local authorities, as the Minister has said, but nevertheless from the point of view of the user, particularly businesses here, ensuring that they get a joined up service running across Business Gateways and the different agencies that are overseen by the Scottish Government.
I mean, should add though, Convener, I mean, and again make the point, Business Gateway has a local government responsibility. We work very closely with Business Gateway in a variety of ways. Dominic's, Dominic's expanded on the point about the work with the strategic board, but Business Gateway are also represented on our strategic labour market group. Business Gateway are also represented on the Women in Enterprise Action Group. So there is a lot of joined up work between us as an administration and Business Gateway.
I guess the report that came from committee and the evidence that was received by committee seemed to indicate that the approach was very patchy across the country. How is that going to be brought together? I mean, Business Gateway is an important element for developing local businesses, an important element in terms of what the government hopes to achieve. There is a complexity that it is part of local government. Really, there has to be some progress made on that.
Well, I suppose that goes back to the points that we've already made, Mr. Beattie, that's why it's important that there is that interaction between the enterprise and skills bodies through the strategic board with Business Gateway, because the strategic board is our mechanism by which we try and bring together those bodies we have responsibility for this area of activity, and recognising that Business Gateway is an essential part of that wider landscape, trying to not bring them within our gambit in the sense of us being directly responsible for them. I think it's appropriate that local government has a important role in this space. It's also important that Business Gateway can be responsive to local circumstances, but certainly bringing them closer together to make sure we have that more coherent system. So that's something we're committed to doing. It's something that we will continue to take forward through the mechanism that has been laid out, and if the committee, I'm sure the committee will continue to take an interest in these matters, then I know that every part of the system I've laid out, government included, will be happy to provide more details.
Just taking another facet of that, the new single entry entry point online, the platform that's been developed and launched just in January there, I believe. I believe that the new website exists alongside the other sites that are already in existence, so they haven't really replaced anything. It's an additional website.
Well, I suppose the task for us is to make it the preeminent one and the go-to place for business. And again, that's by its very nature the type of support can change. So it's always going to be an ongoing process of iterations of the information that could be available, but it's about ensuring that we promote that as the primary source of information, which in turn, yes, could signpost to other sources, but at the very least, businesses, the business community know if I need information, that's the first place I can go, and I can find it there, or it can signpost me to the correct place to go. So yes, you're right in the sense that it is an additional website. There's no denying that, but it is designed to try and bring the landscape better together, to try and ensure that businesses know where to go in the first instance to try and access the information, advice and support that they need to continue to undertake the business activity they do, and to continue to grow and to continue to employ people in the Scottish economy.
I think there was an expectation that this single point of entry would do away with some of the clutter in the landscape in terms of this offering, and you know, the initial indication seems to be that it's not achieved that.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that that could happen as we go forward. There is still an element of it that is in development stage, so that's the point I'm trying to make, that this isn't going to be fixed at any point in time. It's going to continue to change and adapt, and that could involve streamlining, for want of a better term, in terms of the number of websites that are out there. I'm not necessarily saying it's definitively going to do that, but the task for us is to make sure that this new online portal is the place that businesses go to, the primary place that businesses go to, at least in the first instance, to get the information and advice and direction that they're seeking.
Right. Well, I think that's our time with the Minister up. So thank you very much, Minister, and also the members of your team for coming in today. Thank you. I'll suspend the meeting. We'll move into private session.